The Vraxian Dominion had ruled the galaxy for over 1,000 years. They were feared, powerful, and ruthless. No species had ever dared to challenge them. Whenever a weaker civilization rose up, the Dominion crushed them without mercy. But now, something was different. Something was wrong. High Warlord Tarzok stood in the war chamber of the Dominion's grand flagship, the Doomfang. Around him, a group of commanders sat in tense silence. The lights were dimmed, and the only sound in the room was the hum of a holographic screen in the center. The screen showed a grainy, flickering transmission. The last message from an entire fleet that had vanished. "Play it again," Tarzok ordered. The transmission restarted. At first, there was nothing but static. Then, a deep voice came through. "This is Commander Jorek of the Iron Fang. We have reached the outer colonies as ordered, but something is wrong." The image cleared slightly, showing a reptilian officer standing on a Dominion warship's bridge. His scaled face looked uneasy. Behind him, the crew moved nervously. Warning lights flickered in the background. Jorek's voice turned urgent. "Our patrol ships went ahead to scan the area. They never returned." The hologram flickered again. This time, the camera angle changed, showing a view of space from the ship's main viewport. The stars stretched out endlessly. There was nothing there. "We're detecting strange movements," Jorek continued, his voice now edged with fear. "Shadow-like objects appearing and disappearing on our sensors. Our scanners are failing. It's like they are hunting us." The crew behind him flinched as alarms began blaring. A sudden flash of red light filled the screen. Then, chaos. Crew members shouted, running to their stations. The ship's weapons fired blindly into the void, but there was no enemy to see. Jorek turned back to the camera, his expression now one of pure terror. "They are inside." Static. The transmission cut off. The war chamber fell silent. No one spoke. Tarzok turned to his commanders. His golden armor gleamed under the dim light, but his expression was grim. "That was 3 days ago," he said. "Since then, we have heard nothing. The entire fleet, 50 warships, gone. Not a single distress beacon. No wreckage. No survivors." A low murmur of unease spread through the room. The Dominion had fought countless enemies, but never had they seen anything like this. One of the commanders, a battle-scared general named Ralvek, growled. "This is impossible. No force in the galaxy could do this. There must be a malfunction in our systems." Tarzok narrowed his eyes. "You believe it was a mistake." Ralvek nodded firmly. "A fleet that size does not simply disappear. Perhaps a cosmic storm, a black hole." Tarzok raised a clawed hand, cutting him off. "Then explain this." He tapped the controls, and a new hologram appeared. It was not from the Dominion ships. It was a human transmission. The screen showed a dark battlefield, the twisted remains of Dominion warships floating in the void. The image zoomed in, revealing figures in black armor moving through the wreckage. Bipedal, efficient, unstoppable. One of the humans turned toward the camera. Though their face was hidden behind a helmet, there was something chilling about the way they moved. Calm, fearless, predatory. Then, in deep metallic tones, a voice came through. "You are not the hunters anymore." The transmission ended. The silence in the war chamber grew heavier. Ralvek's face darkened. "What are they?" Tarzok's voice was quiet, but his words sent a chill through the room. "They call themselves humans." No one spoke. No one dared to, because for the first time in the history of the Dominion, they were the ones afraid. The war chamber was silent. No one moved. No one spoke. The word hung in the air like a curse. Humans. Tarzok's golden eyes narrowed as he studied his commanders. These were the fiercest warriors of the Dominion, conquerors of 100 worlds. Yet now, they looked uncertain, uneasy. Finally, General Ralvek broke the silence. "We have fought the strongest species in the galaxy, the Colver, that Catherine swarm, the warlords of Dracos. None could stand against us. And now you expect us to fear a new species. Tarzok's clawed fingers tapped against the table. Not fear, he said slowly. Understand. He gestured to the holographic screen. The human warriors moved through the wreckage of the Dominion fleet with terrifying precision. Their dark armor reflected no light, their weapons barely visible, but the results were clear. Entire warships had been torn apart, as if the humans had studied the Dominion's weaknesses and struck with perfect efficiency. Ralvek's nostrils flared. Then let us hunt them, as we always do. A low chuckle came from the shadows. The sound made every commander turn. It came from a tall, thin figure leaning against the wall. Grand Strategist Velok. Unlike the armored warlords, Velok wore a flowing black robe, his pale blue skin almost ghostly in the dim light. He smiled, showing needle-like teeth. "Oh, General," he murmured. "That is exactly what the last fleet thought." Ralvek growled, but Tarzok raised a hand to silence him. "Explain." Velok stepped forward and touched the control panel. The screen changed again, this time showing a human vessel, or at least, what was left of it. The ship was small compared to Dominion warships, but the hull was scarred with battle damage. There were no markings, no insignias. The Iron Fang managed to destroy one of their ships before it was lost. Velok said, "Our scouts recovered the wreckage from deep space." He tapped the screen again, zooming in on the inside of the destroyed ship. The image showed bodies, human bodies. For the first time, the Dominion commanders could see what they were fighting. They looked fragile, smaller than the reptilian warriors of the Dominion. No claws, no armored skin, no natural weapons. Their bodies were lean, their faces strangely expressive, frozen in death. And yet, there was something wrong. Ralvek scowled. "These creatures do not look terrifying." Velok grinned. "No, they do not." He tapped the controls again. This time, the screen showed logs recovered from the ship, messages, mission reports, strange human writings. "There is one thing that troubled me," Velok said. Despite their primitive appearance, the humans were not afraid. The screen flickered, playing a final recovered transmission. A human voice crackled through the speakers. "To any survivors, keep moving. We knew this mission was one way. We knew we would die. That does not matter. What matters is that we send the message. We are coming, and we will not stop." A cold shiver ran through the room. Tarzok's eyes darkened. This was no mistake. "No," Velok agreed, his grin widening. "This was a test. The humans wanted to see how we would respond." A new kind of silence filled the room. Ralvek slammed a fist on the table. "Then we crush them," he snarled. "If they wish for war, we give it to them." Tarzok leaned forward. His golden armor gleamed under the dim lights. "Then we send a new fleet." He tapped the console, and a map of the galaxy appeared. A red circle marked the location of the missing fleet. Another mark, a human colony, flashed nearby. Tarzok's voice was cold, final. "We will not wait for them to attack again. We burn their worlds first." A deep growl of approval spread through the room. But Velok only smiled. He looked at the image of the destroyed human ship, at the dead, fragile creatures inside, and he remembered their words. "We knew this mission was one way." He did not smile because he doubted the Dominion's power. He smiled because he understood something that the others did not. The humans had sent soldiers to die, on purpose. And that meant only one thing. They were not afraid of war. They were prepared for it. And they had just begun. The Dominion fleet moved like a storm, hundreds of warships, each one powerful enough to reduce a planet to ash. Their engines roared through the void, leaving trails of fire as they jumped from one sector to another. Their mission was simple: find the humans, destroy them, end the threat before it spreads. General Ralvek stood on the bridge of the Bloodfang, his personal warship, His golden armor gleamed under the red emergency lights. His tail twitched in excitement. It had been too long since he had crushed an enemy. He turned to his second-in-command, a scared warrior named Vortak. "Are we close?" Vortak's sharp claws danced over the control panel. "Yes, General. The human colony is only one jump away." Ralvek bared his fangs. "Good. Prepare the fleet. We will strike fast and leave nothing behind." Vortak hesitated. "Sir, we still know very little about them." "Perhaps." Ralvek snarled. "Do you fear them?" Vortak stiffened. "No, General. But the last fleet." "The last fleet was weak," Ralvek growled. "We are stronger. We are faster. The humans may have surprised us once, but this time, we are ready." Vortak nodded, but deep down, he was not sure. The fleet jumped. In a flash of burning light, the Bloodfang and its armada appeared at the edge of the human colony. Ralvek leaned forward. He expected defenses, a shield, a fleet waiting for battle. But what he saw made him laugh. The human world below them was undefended. No warships, no battle stations, no orbital weapons, just a small planet glowing softly under its weak sun. Ralvek grinned. "They do not even try to resist." He turned to Vortak. "Order the attack. Fire at will." Vortak nodded, though something still felt wrong. The Dominion warships opened fire. Red beams of destruction rained down on the human colony. Cities burned. Forests turned to ash. Mountains crumbled under the firepower of the Dominion's finest warships. Ralvek watched with satisfaction. "This is too easy." And then the humans answered. At first, it was just a sound, a strange crackling signal that spread across the Dominion ships. It did not seem like a weapon. It was a voice. A human voice. "Is this all you have?" Ralvek's eyes narrowed. "What trick is this?" Vortak's claws shook over the control panel. "General, something is happening." The screen flashed. Ralvek turned just in time to see his fleet start to die. It was not a counterattack. It was not an army of warships rising from the planet. It was already inside. The Dominion ships themselves were turning against them. Weapons shut down. Shields collapsed. Power systems failed. And then the true horror began. A Bloodfang soldier let out a scream. He clawed at his armor, his eyes wide with terror. "They are inside. They are inside." Ralvek grabbed him by the throat. "What are you talking about?" The soldier could only shake, his body trembling. "They are in my mind. They are in my head. They are watching me." Ralvek threw him aside in disgust. But then he saw more. More warriors collapsing. More warriors screaming. Something was crawling inside their heads. Something cold. Something human. The lights flickered. The walls of the ship groaned like a dying beast. Vortak gasped. "General, the ships, they are no longer ours." Ralvek turned back to the screen. The weapons of his own fleet were locking onto each other. The Bloodfang's own cannons turned toward a Dominion warship, as if controlled by an invisible hand. Ralvek felt the first true fear of his life. He growled, "How?" And then he saw it. A single human ship, small, fragile. It floated between the Dominion warships, a ghost in the darkness. A message appeared on the screen. 2 words. "Your turn." Then the human ship vanished, and the Dominion fleet began to burn. Ralvek had faced war his entire life. He had conquered planets, crushed rebellions, and wiped out entire species without hesitation. But never had he felt fear like this. His fleet, the mighty Dominion Armada, was dying, and he did not know why. The Bloodfang shook violently as another Dominion warship exploded nearby. Not from enemy fire, not from an external attack. The ships were turning against themselves. "General," Vortak's voice was sharp with terror. "Our own defense systems are locking onto us." Ralvek slammed his fists against the control panel. "How?" "We disabled their communications. Their fleet is nowhere in sight. Vortak's claws trembled as he worked the controls. "Sir, it is not their fleet." He hesitated, his throat tightening. "It is us." Relvek's eyes burned with fury. "Explain." Vortak swallowed hard. "The systems are compromised. It started the moment we entered the system. The AI, the targeting computers, the life support systems, they are no longer under our control." Relvek bared his fangs. "A virus." Vortak shook his head. "No, General. A virus corrupts. This is not corruption. This is command. Something is controlling the ships, something human." Relvek growled. He refused to believe it. Humans were weak, small, nothing compared to the Dominion. And yet, the evidence was everywhere. The Bloodfang's weapons would not fire unless the enemy wanted them to. The warships were attacking each other like rabid beasts. And worst of all, his warriors were breaking. Across the ship, the crew screamed. Soldiers clutched their heads, their voices raw with agony. Some turned their weapons on themselves, ending their own lives rather than face whatever was happening inside their minds. "Make it stop. Make it stop." One warrior howled, scratching at his own skull. Vortak's breathing was shallow. "They are in our heads, General." His voice was hollow. "They are speaking to us." Relvek snarled. "Lies. We have the strongest minds in the Dominion. No species has ever." He stopped, because he heard it. A whisper. A cold human whisper, sliding into his thoughts like a dagger. "Do you feel it, General?" Relvek's vision blurred. This was impossible. No one could enter his mind. No one. "We are watching." His breath hitched. "We have been watching for a long time." Relvek roared, shaking his head violently. "Get out of my mind." The voice only laughed. "You are not the hunter here." Relvek's blood turned to ice. The whisper was not just inside his head. It was everywhere. His entire fleet could hear it. It whispered to the pilots as they fired on their own allies. It whispered to the engineers as they sabotaged their own engines. It whispered to the warriors as they fell to their knees, weeping in terror. The humans had never needed a fleet. They were already here. The Dominion had thought themselves the greatest predators in the galaxy, but they had never hunted something like this before, because this was not a battle. This was a trap. Relvek's claws dug into the metal console. He forced his voice to remain strong. "How do we stop them?" Vortak's face was pale. "We cannot." The Bloodfang trembled again as explosions rocked the ship. The screens flashed wildly. Hull breaches, fire in the lower decks, total system failure. But none of it compared to the psychological attack. The humans were not just killing them. They were breaking them. They wanted the Dominion to understand, to feel the kind of fear they had inflicted on others, to know what it was like to be weak. Relvek's knees almost buckled. He forced himself to stand tall. "Vortak," he growled, his voice a shadow of its former power. "Find us a way out." Vortak's claws flew over the controls. "Sir, there is only one option. We retreat." Relvek's pride screamed against the idea. Retreat. The Dominion did not run. They did not fear anyone. But what choice did he have? One by one, his warships were falling silent. Some exploded, torn apart by their own weapons. Some simply shut down, as if surrendering to an invisible force. And others remained intact, but no one answered their signals. Those ships were no longer Dominion ships. They belonged to the humans now. Relvek's fists clenched, jumped to hyperspace. Now. Vortak did not hesitate. He activated the emergency retreat protocol. The Dominion fleet, what was left of it, turned and fled. But as they jumped away, Relvek heard the whisper one last time. It was calm, cold, and worse than anything, it was amused. "You can run, General, but you cannot hide." Relvek gritted his teeth as the ship vanished into hyperspace. He had never feared an enemy before. But as the Bloodfang escaped the battlefield, Ralvek realized one terrible truth. He had never known true terror until now. Ralvek sat in the command chair of the Bloodfang, staring at the swirling void of hyperspace. His claws dug into the armrests, his muscles tight with fury, and something far worse. Fear. For the first time in Dominion history, they had been forced to retreat. The ship's command deck was silent. No one spoke. No one dared. The crew was shaken, their bodies trembling from the thing that had invaded their minds. The voice. The whisper. Ralvek growled, trying to shake off the feeling. He was a warrior. He did not fear whispers. He had seen civilizations burn, had slaughtered countless enemies. But this was different. He turned to Vortak. Status. Vortak's eyes were hollow. He was a veteran, one of the most disciplined warriors in the Dominion. Yet even he looked as though something inside him had cracked. The fleet. Vortak hesitated. We lost over half, General. And the ones that escaped, many are not responding. Ralvek's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Vortak took a deep breath. Their ships are intact, but no one is answering our calls, as if the crew is gone. Ralvek's claws tightened. Find out what happened. Now. Vortak hesitated again. Sir, we received a message from one of the missing ships. Ralvek's eyes snapped to him. Play it. Vortak nodded, his fingers trembling as he activated the console. A garbled transmission filled the room. Static. Heavy breathing. Then, a voice. Help us. The voice was not Dominion. It was deep. Rough. Ralvek's stomach twisted. It was human. But how? That was a Dominion warship. More static. Then another voice. They are here. They are inside. A loud bang. A scream. Then silence. Then the whisper. We told you, General. You cannot run. The message cut off. The room was silent once more. Ralvek forced himself to breathe. His warriors were watching him. They needed a leader. He rose from his chair, his voice firm. We are returning to Dominion space. Prepare for war. Vortak nodded, but his movements were slow, uncertain. Ralvek knew why. It was no longer just about firepower, no longer about strategy. The humans were inside their minds. And that was a war the Dominion had never fought before. The Bloodfang continued its journey, but something was wrong. It started with the lights. They flickered, just for a moment, but it was enough. Then, the temperature dropped. The air turned cold, biting at the warrior's skin. A low hum filled the ship. Not from the engines, not from the machinery. It was something else. Ralvek stood tall. Report. Vortak checked the systems. All systems are functional, sir. But his voice shook. Ralvek could hear the fear spreading through his crew. Something was happening. Then, the whisper returned. You should not have run. The lights died. The ship lurched, throwing warriors to the ground. Alarms screamed. Emergency lights flickered on, casting long, eerie shadows. And then, the screaming began. From the lower decks, from everywhere. Ralvek's heart pounded. He turned to the security screens. His warriors were fighting something. But there was nothing there. They were firing at empty air. Yet one by one, they fell, their bodies jerking as if struck by invisible weapons. Then, Ralvek saw something that made his blood run cold. The fallen warriors were getting up. But not as Dominion. Their movements were wrong, twisted. Their eyes were empty. They turned their heads toward the cameras and smiled. Ralvek felt something he had never felt before. Horror. Vortak backed away from the console. General, we need to abandon ship. Ralvek bared his fangs. No, we stand and fight. But even as he said it, he knew the truth. This was not a battle they could win. The humans had already won. They were not just warriors. They were something else, and the Dominion had invaded the wrong enemy's space. Ralvek's claws shook as he grabbed his weapon. For the first time in his life, he did not know if he would survive. Ralvek's grip tightened around his weapon as the sounds of screaming filled the command deck. His warriors, the best the Dominion had to offer, were being slaughtered, and worst of all, they were dying without even knowing what was killing them. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to think. He was a general of the Dominion. He had fought in wars. He had crushed entire species beneath his boots. But now, standing in the dim emergency lights of the Bloodfang, he realized something terrifying. This was no ordinary war. Vortak stumbled forward, his breathing heavy. "General, we need tow." The ship lurched again. This time, it was not an engine failure. It was something else. The walls groaned. Metal creaked. It was as if the ship itself was alive. Then, the whisper returned. "We warned you, General. You cannot run." Ralvek snarled. "Show yourself, coward." A low chuckle echoed through the ship, but there was no source. The sound was everywhere, creeping into their bones. Vortak turned to the console, his claws shaking as he tried to regain control of the ship. "Sir, something is overriding our systems." Ralvek's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" Vortak's hands moved across the screen, trying to pull up security footage, communications, anything. But every screen flickered with one single image. Eyes. Dozens, hundreds. Human eyes. Watching. Judging. A single word appeared on the screen in the human language. "Observe." And then the footage began playing. Not of the Dominion. Of the humans. They were different from what Ralvek had expected. He had always believed humans were weak, fragile creatures who relied on technology to survive. But these images, they told another story. The humans in the footage were monsters, not because of how they looked, but because of what they had survived. Wars that lasted centuries. Battles fought on planets so deadly that no other species could live there. Creatures from their own world that could kill with a single bite, yet humans hunted them for sport. A world where everything, even the air, the water, the land itself, tried to kill them. And still, they thrived. Ralvek's blood ran cold. These creatures had never known peace. They had never been prey. And that was when he understood. The Dominion had always thought they were the apex predators. They had always believed that they were the ones who brought fear to others. But humanity had never feared them. Because humans were something far worse. They were the things even predators feared. The footage stopped, the lights flickered. And then, from the speakers, a voice spoke. Not a whisper this time. A cold, calm voice, a human voice. "You wanted a war," it said. "Now you have one." Suddenly, the ship's gravity failed. Dominion warriors were lifted into the air, their bodies slamming against walls and ceilings. Screams filled the command deck as soldiers clawed for stability. Ralvek activated his boots, locking himself onto the floor. His mind raced. This wasn't just an attack. This was a message. Humans were not fighting them with weapons alone. They were inside the ship, inside their minds. Vortak floated helplessly, his body twisting in the zero gravity. "General, the humans. They're everywhere." The ship trembled again. But this time, it wasn't an external force. Something was moving inside the walls. The whisper returned, softer now, almost amused. "You thought you were the hunters." The lights flickered again, but this time, when they turned back on, the command deck was no longer the same. Bodies were missing. Ralvek's eyes widened. The warriors who had been thrown into the air, the ones who had been floating just seconds ago, they were gone. No bodies, no blood, just empty space. Vortak gasped. His claws clutched at the air, searching for something, anything, to hold onto. His breathing was ragged, his eyes darting wildly. Where did they go? Ralvek didn't answer, because he already knew. They hadn't been taken somewhere else. They had been erased. The Dominion had spent centuries spreading fear across the galaxy. But now, they had found something they feared, and it was coming for them. Relvek stood alone on the command deck of the Bloodfang. The once mighty Dominion warship now felt like a tomb. Silence. The screams had stopped. The crew was gone. The soldiers, the strongest warriors of the Dominion, had vanished without a trace. He gritted his teeth, gripping his weapon. He had always believed that the Dominion was the strongest force in the galaxy, that no species could ever make them afraid. But now, standing in the dim emergency lights, he knew the truth. They had never faced humans before. A voice crackled through the ship's speakers. Calm, controlled, human. You took so many lives, it said. You thought no one would stop you. Relvek's claws dug into his palms. Who are you? He growled. The voice chuckled. That's the funny part. You already know. The screams around the bridge came to life. Footage played, not of war, but of the Dominion's crimes. Planets burned, cities destroyed, entire species erased, and at the center of it all, the Dominion standing tall, believing themselves to be untouchable. Relvek's breathing grew heavier. He had been part of those campaigns. He had led those attacks. But never, not once, had he felt guilt. Until now. The voice continued. You made a mistake, General. The screens changed. The images of the Dominion's cruelty disappeared. Now, it was Earth. At first, it looked peaceful. Blue oceans, green forests, tall cities shining under the sun. But then the footage shifted. Wars. Endless wars. Humans fighting each other, not for survival, not for territory, but because it was in their nature. Relvek's claws trembled. Humanity had never known peace. The strongest species in the galaxy had been forged in conflict and chaos. They weren't warriors. They weren't soldiers. They were something worse. Predators who had spent their entire history fighting their own kind. If humans could do that to themselves, what would they do to an enemy? The ship trembled. Relvek's heart pounded as a new sound filled the bridge. Boots on metal. Not an army. Not a fleet. Just one man. The Dominion general turned slowly. A human stood at the entrance of the bridge. Tall, clad in black armor, his face hidden behind a helmet. Not a word was spoken. The human stepped forward, his boots echoing in the silence. Relvek raised his weapon, claws shaking. Stay back, he warned. The human stopped. And then he removed his helmet. Relvek had expected something monstrous, some terrifying creature from a nightmare. Instead, the human's face was calm, his expression unreadable. But his eyes were worse than any horror Relvek had ever seen. There was no hatred in them, no rage, only cold judgment. You can't kill me, Relvek stammered. I am a general of the Dominion. My people will. The human raised a single hand. The ship's lights flickered. And then everything changed. The air turned heavy. Relvek's lungs burned as his body collapsed to the floor. His vision blurred. His limbs refused to move. He struggled, his claws scratching against the metal. Do what? What is this? The human knelt beside him, unshaken, unbothered. This is fear, he said quietly. The real kind. Relvek gasped, his mind racing. He had fought in hundreds of battles. He had survived the deadliest wars. But now, faced with one human, he realized the truth. He had never truly known fear until this moment. The human stood up, his voice calm. Your species thought they were the monsters of this galaxy. He turned, walking toward the exit. But you were wrong. The lights flickered one last time. Relvek tried to scream, to beg. But before he could, the ship's systems collapsed. Darkness swallowed everything. And the last thing Relvek heard was silence. Humanity had arrived. and the galaxy would never be the same.